One of these significant differences in the Web API compared to traditional ASP.NET MVC controllers, one of the differences is how the Web API will route requests into the action methods. With the Web API, the HTTP method being used plays a role. The HTTP method is the verb used in the HTTP message, and the common verbs are get, post, put, and delete. Those are the verbs that the Web API will route by default. You can also handle additional verbs if you need to do something like WebDAV. You can do that and handle additional verbs by using an accept verbs attribute. What the Web API will do is if there is a request for /videos, the Web API will look for a video controller and then look for a method on that controller starting with the word get. So I could have an action called get videos, and because this is an HTTP get message, the framework will invoke get videos. But I could also call it get whatever. It's just because it starts with the letters GET. That's why that particular action method will receive the request. The Web API also registers these routes slightly differently. Since there is no action that's going to be in the URL for the routing engine to pick apart, it's using the verb instead. If you look at the default route configuration in a new MVC application, and I'll show you where to find this in a minute, you'll see the default routing rule for a Web API. It's done with an extension method map HTTP route. Notice there is no action in the URL template, and it's also important to note that the path for this needs to start with API. After looking at this, I know the proper way to reach my video controller is to use /API/video as a URL in the browser. That will invoke the get method since we have a get request. Let's try it out. So before we try to view the controller output in the browser again, let me go in and make one change to this controller. I'm going to do a refactor, rename, and change the name to videos controller, plural, because it's really going to represent a collection of videos, not a single video, so it makes more sense for it to be plural. And now, as far as the default routing rules, routing's always configured during application startup, so of course that means you have to look in global.asax.cs. Inside of there is the application start event, and here is the line of code that we'll call routeconfig.registerRoutes. Routeconfig is a class that is added to a project by default when you start a new MVC4 project. It goes into the app start directory. There's a number of things in here that configure the runtime during application startup. And if we look in routeconfig, indeed there's the map HTTP route extension method being called to set up the default routing for our Web API controllers. And now I know if I want to reach the videos controller, then I should do a build first and come into the browser, and instead of doing /video/get, I should be doing /API/videos. And now I do receive a response from the server. Internet Explorer doesn't want to show me that response, it wants me to save it or open it, and that's because it realizes that the server returned JSON. So I could open or save that, or I could use a different browser that would actually show me the result in the browser window. But I'm going to try a slightly different approach, which is to go to a command line utility called curl, or CURL. This is a utility that allows you to send off web requests from the command line. So for instance, I could request localhost :1341, that's where the application lives, and it shows me all the HTML that would be rendered by the home page. And that also means I should be able to go to /API/videos, and by default, it sends a GET request. That invokes the GET action, and I can see value 1 and value 2. They're formatted into a JSON array, and that's exactly what I expected to receive back based on the code that's inside of the GET method. Let's actually run this with the debugger one. So let me put an F9 here on these two different GET actions, and while I'm at it, let me rename this to GET all videos, just to give it a different name. And I also want to put a breakpoint on the delete and see how this works. And now I'll do a build since I changed the action name. Do an F5 to run it with the debugger. That'll launch it in the browser. But what I really want to do is come back to curl and say, let's issue that same request again, /API/videos. So it's just trying to map the HTTP verb to the method name, but it doesn't have to be an exact match. It just has to start with a GET. And now what about this other GET that includes an ID? And actually, let me stop debugging once. And actually, when we send a response back from here, I want to include the ID that we see in the response. And so I'll do a build and hit F5. And let's come back to curl. And by the way, with curl, you can use the capital X parameter to specify the method that you want to use. So I'll just make it explicit that this is a get. And we'll try that out one more time. That arrives at this get action. Hit F5 to continue. And let's try with an ID. So I want to get the video with an ID of 5. And notice that arrives at the get method that takes an int parameter. So this is also something special when it comes to Web API, because the traditional MVC routing wouldn't distinguish between two methods that have essentially the same name that just differ by the method signature it would give up. But in the Web API case, you can have a get that doesn't take any parameters and a get that does take a parameter. It doesn't really matter that I rename this to all videos. It's really just looking for a method that starts with get. But it's able to distinguish between those two because it does see an ID that arrived in the URL that got put into route data and got passed into us. So we can see the 5 come in. That should be very familiar if you've done MVC programming in the past. And if I hit F5 to continue, then we get value 5. This is working well. What happens if I try to delete the video with an ID of 5? Because I have a delete action in the background. Now I get back some sort of weird error message about the file or directory does not exist on the server. And that seems peculiar, and this is something that you might run into occasionally with the Web API. And the problem is that not all web servers allow all the HTTP methods to come through. So pretty much any web server is going to allow a get or a post because we all use them in day-to-day web programming with HTML. But not every web server is configured to allow a put or a delete. Those aren't as common. And that's what's happening in this case. This is running in IIS Express, which is a lightweight version of IIS that now ships with Visual Studio in 2012, and it's the default host for any web applications that you build. What I need to do is go into the configuration file for IIS Express. That configuration file lives in my documents directory under a folder called IIS Express/config, and it's inside of there where I can find application host. And it just so happens that I know I'm looking for an entry in here called extensionless URL integrated 40. And right here we can see that the only verbs it's going to map to that particular handler are get, head, post, and debug. I also want to add put and delete, so we handle those verbs as well and allow them to pass through to our logic. I should just be able to save this, and then we can come back out to curl and try to delete the video with an ID of 5. And now that request arrived at our server. So inside of these action methods, what we would ostensibly be doing is working with a database or some sort of persistent data store or the file system to look up videos, create videos, in this case, delete a video. But before we get to that, I want to talk about another important feature of the Web API, which is content negotiation.